Before we go anywhere, could everyone make sure that your phone or any electronic device that you happen to have with you is turned off or the sound is defeated? My name is Earl Swift. I'm a fellow of the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, and it's my honor to appear before you today to introduce my fellow, Sandhya Shukla, and the project to which she's devoted her fellowship these past 7 months, Cross Cultures of Modern Harlem. Harlem is one of the few neighborhoods in all the world that conjures an image in the mind of whoever hears its name, whether that person lives in Canton or Khartoum or Casper, Wyoming. And as is the case with many children of the suburbs, my own mental picture of the place was informed by gritty 1970s cinematic fare, police procedurals mostly, along with a little blaxploitation seasoning, and precious little else. And on trips to Harlem, I came to see that this Hollywood take on the place was not only obsolete, but that it had been sequeled by a procession of realities equally obsolete by the time I got there. That Harlem was constantly morphing and was and is more an organism than a place. As Dr. Shukla asked in her fellowship proposal back in the fall of 2011, what do we make of Harlem, the global capital of blackness, when it's no longer majority African American? What sort of meaning will East Harlem's El Barrio have for Latinos when Puerto Ricans can no longer afford to live there? How can a quintessentially racial place accommodate new kinds of difference? She comes well prepared for this project. After 2 years as an assistant professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, San Diego, she spent 10 years at Columbia University in New York as assistant and later associate professor of anthropology and Asian American studies, during which time she lived in Harlem. She studied the neighborhood and the tangled subject of race in America since early in her career, has delivered papers and lectures on Harlem to conferences, workshops, and peers at the University of Lancaster, Mount Holyoke College, the University of Hong Kong, Columbia University, the University of Vermont, Cornell University, Princeton, and Northwestern, to the American Anthropological Association and the American Studies Association, to name but a few, and believe me when I tell you I'm exercising great restraint to keep the list that short. She served as an associate professor of English here at the University of Virginia since 2008 and was its director of American Studies from 2009 until last year. Won't you please welcome Dr. Sandhya Shukla.
Thank you, Earl. Thanks, too, to the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, where I've been in residence this past academic year.
Sandra, I'm sorry to get you on the mic.
So I was thanking the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, don't want to lose that. It's a comfortable perch for sitting, a gracious space to think, and a wonderful place to learn. Rob Vaughn and Ann Spencer especially have facilitated my stay with great generosity, and as many of you here know, they help to make the VFH a source of continual intellectual pleasures for so many in our communities, both inside and outside of the Academy. So the neighborhood is changing. This is a common refrain of modern urban life, a way to describe, on the one hand, a material experience of economic and demographic shifts, and on the other, something more elusive, the sense that a lived space feels different from what it was before. The available script, which surrounds the more generic statement about neighborhood change, is a clash of identities that has resulted from new people moving in and older residents beginning to move out. And often the discourse of change can also thinly veil the anxieties attending racial, ethnic, and class conflict, either conflicts that have already occurred or that are about to unfold. The neighborhood changing, then, is not usually offered up in optimistic or happy tones. Stories about Harlem in the past and the present can be thematized too by neighborhood change. Harlem, the capital of global blackness, the site of historic Little Italy, the setting for storied El Barrio, has indeed experienced dramatic changes in the last few decades. Changes that include, but are not limited to, waves of middle and upper class people that include both whites and African Americans, moving in to inhabit, some might say occupy, areas of Harlem as a result of the forces of gentrification. The nature of neighborhood transformation in Harlem today is certainly dramatic and spectacular. But change, I want to argue, is part of an essential experience of Harlem, as it is for many, if not most, cities. Change is a proxy term, a code, for economic shifts, and it's also shorthand for forms of racial ethnic diversity that result from many people's moving in and out of an area. A diversity that finds its form in the fact of living together in conflict and intimacy. Change is a linguistic shortcut to the development of a social world of multiplicity. If there's a tendency to think of that multiplicity in very contemporary ways, that it's a product of some new moment of capitalism or urban formation, I want to propose for today, and for a larger project on Harlem that this presentation derives from, that this world of differences existing together, diversity, multiplicity, has been there from the get-go. To guide us through that world of differences, I want for us to think today about Vito Marcantonio. And he's pictured here in this first slide. Vito Marcantonio represented East Harlem in the U.S. Congress for 14 years between 1934 and 1950. He was an incredibly important figure for the left and a target of much red baiting. He was also a hometown hero, giving issues of East Harlem and East Harlem itself a national profile. Related to both, he also emblematized a kind of otherness, politically, ethnically, for a nation that was coming to terms with its diversity. For someone from what many scholars would term an ethnic enclave, Marcantonio might seem to stand out as unusual. Instead of looking in and inward, the practice that is associated with the notion of an enclave, Marcantonio was open to the world, expansive, and able to imagine all sorts of possibilities beyond neighborhood blocks. But the opposition here between locality as inward-looking and globality as outward-looking is one that I want to challenge in this work. Marcantonio's politics, I shall argue, might be seen as emerging from the place that bore him, not Italian Harlem, not East Harlem, not even immigrant Harlem, but a Harlem more broadly rendered. His was a politics of what I call cross-cultures, reaching across one kind of difference into another and producing something new. Casting Marcantonio's politics in terms of cross-cultural movement compels a rethinking simultaneously of what sorts of exchanges occurred at the time in Harlem and what models for modern urban life might be posed for our future. The argument of this presentation is structured by three main and overlapping points. One, I shall explore how Vito Marcantonio embodied and developed a utopian form of identity that was based not in an idea of individual differences lying side by side, but apart from one another, but instead in a sense that interacting, exchanging, and identifying with something outside of yourself, some kind of otherness, is the preferred way to live in difference. And here I want to highlight that phrasing, living in difference versus living with difference. Two, I propose that Marcantonio's radical politics enabled that sort of cross-cultural imagining and living. And three, I will explain how place shaped Marcantonio and was shaped by Marcantonio's crossings. I want ultimately to signal to a broader argument about the place of Harlem and the idea of place more generally. To get there, I'd like to take a close look, effectively read Marcantonio's politics. Through a discussion of some of the issues that Marcantonio took on and the resulting utterances and events, a sort of text, I hope to illuminate the larger frame of cross-cultural exchange that made Marcantonio so unusual for his time and ours. So there's three sections here. One that discusses Harlem geographically and culturally, laying out what's at stake for the sort of rethinking I'm arguing for the questions I'm interested in. The second section discusses Vito Marcantonio's politics as providing different sorts of answers to the prevailing questions. And the third section, briefer than the first two, lays out how two concepts, cross-culturality and globality, in my mind explain Vito Marcantonio and point the way to reconceptualizing Harlem. I should say that the work I'm presenting here is part of that larger project that Earl described so well, perhaps better than better than I could even do at this moment. And then the chapter from which this work is drawn looks at Marc Antonio and Marcus Garvey as different kinds of figures for the construction of a radical cross-cultural politics. In order to better understand what this work does, it's helpful always to say what it does not. I'm not really writing a biography of Marc Antonio. There's plenty to say about him, and there's also great value to be had in a life story. But my specific focus on moments of exchange, I hope, illuminate more than Vito Marcantonio the man. They should construct a window onto the kinds of exchanges that are made possible by the social space of Harlem. Marcantonio certainly was remarkable, but really he cannot be understood apart from place. His work might be understood to perform a kind of spatial mapping of Harlem, telling us who and what was there, and even more importantly, how relations of place constituted its very meaning. Another caveat is that this isn't a political biography. There's lots to say about his specific relationships with the Communist Party and his leadership of the American Labor Party, and also a kind of debate about how it is that he was able to stay in office for 16 years. For a left-wing figure, I mean, this is really astonishing. But I'm arguing here for an analytic that helps us to see Marcantonio's politics as a site and symptom of exchange, and understand how radical politics, its form and content, furthered the social experience of multiplicity. In other words, how were Marcantonio's politics an uber example of a cross-cultural Harlem? I want, with Marcantonio, to tell a story of Harlem that's a little different from the other ones out there. Not to deny the other points about there being difficulties or conflicts, but to see what might happen to the big story when we put other experiences and understandings into the mix. And so the genre of the talk might be understood to be place biography, looking at what Marcantonio did and said to conclude something not just about the time, but about the place. And we look, too, at the place producing Marcantonio. What is this place, then? Harlem has historically been full of all sorts of exchanges, engagements, and dialogues. In territorial terms, it is East Harlem, West and Central Harlem, particularized regions that are named to identify not only lateral coordinates, but also areas that have different resources. These regions have also had different demographic content, which makes them ethnic racial places unto themselves. East Harlem has traditionally been the destination for a range of migrants, Jewish, Italian, Puerto Rican, and more recently, Mexican and other Central Americans, and smaller numbers of Africans and Chinese. West and Central Harlem have been where African Americans who are migrants from the U.S. South and other black immigrants from the Caribbean and African countries settled. This sort of signification is also a social scientific phenomenon, wherein territory corresponds to race or ethnicity, in which anthropologist Michel Laguerre writes of space becoming minoritized. While on the one hand this naming has an air of falsity to it, West Harlem has immigrants and East Harlem has had African Americans, the other important point is that the way these spaces have become minoritized fail to account for all sorts of exchanges, transfers, relations really, on the ground. Minoritized spaces include particular neighborhood blocks that have changed over into something else, wherein Jewish Harlem becomes Italian Harlem, or Italian Harlem becomes Puerto Rican Harlem, or, as it has been called, El Barrio becomes largely Mexican Harlem. Another story is slightly different. Black Harlem becomes more specialized, containing African Harlem or Little Senegal. I'm rehearsing here an ecological model in sociology, which, while suggesting a natural push and pull and changeover, much like in nature, with a quasi-organic metaphor thematizing the narrative, unwittingly proposes that the transitions are seamless and ultimately complete. But of course, that's not how history or social relations work. There's lots of bleeding over when new people come into a neighborhood and others are leaving. In fact, many different kinds of people mostly live together. And cultural representation, literature, film, music, and the like, which we look to in order to illuminate what the numbers or social scientists have missed, has detailed in lyrical and realist terms the experiences of people living amongst many forms of difference, with others both like and unlike them. And it's important, too, to raise a point about blackness. Harlem is a space in which many different understandings of blackness, U.S., Latin American, West Indian, African, Puerto Rican, continually collided and interacted. No one identity really stands still. In an atmosphere of change, what exactly is the essential racial ethnic character of Harlem? This question has been posed by residents and social observers alike, with important political debates about the nature of representation and multiple concepts of home emerging in the place of a clear or certain answer. Related questions then become, how do we talk about that diversity? How do we describe change? What is the language we use? Multiculturalism, multiplicity, diversity, something else? And for what ends? For something utopian, something realist, something cautionary? In order to see this multiple and changing Harlem, I propose that we look not only across the imagined boundaries of ethnic and racial groups, but that we also construct a different geography that includes East, West, and Central. What then do we do with a place that is truly multiply constituted? To begin with, we dispense with the notion of a stable identity and begin to engage the encounters that occur on the edges of community formations, while also remaining attentive to the investments of race and place. Vito Marcantonio embodies the ability to both be in a place and represent a community and cross over into something else. He gives us one way, then, to talk about cross cultures. Vito Marcantonio was born in 1904 in East Harlem and died in 1954. This span of years meant that he was historical witness to a bevy of world and domestic events: 2 world wars, the development of the Soviet Union, the Korean War, and an important phase of the civil rights movement. Alas, he was more than a witness. He was an active participant in, and many say he shaped the course of, crucial political developments of the first half of the 20th century. Marcantonio came from Italian Harlem, was of Italian Harlem, and remained through his life a part of Italian Harlem. Accounts from a variety of observers, those who were friends with him, who worked with him, elaborate the ways that Marcantonio felt committed to residents there. That's sort of, they always say, everybody loved him. Root around, though, and you see all sorts of cracks. When I spoke to the late Peter Refrano, an Italian-American priest of one of the most famous Italian-American Catholic churches, Our Lady of Mount Carmel in East Harlem, he said Marcantonio was a traitor. This diversity of opinion is hardly unusual for a public figure like Marcantonio, but it also provides a key to understanding political and cultural currents that extend beyond the cult of personality. Heterogeneity of perspectives on Marcantonio speaks to the specific racial ethnic contours of 20th century urban life. East Harlem of the 1930s and 1940s was a place in the midst of dramatic transformations. Jews were still present, but on the wane, increasingly moving out of Harlem to other parts of the city. Italians, who had a large and active community there since the late 1800s, were beginning to move out in small numbers, and Puerto Rican migrants were developing a stronghold there. The social result of these shifts was that East Harlem contained many different kinds of conflicts among groups, captured peoples who had experienced discrimination, and was the context for a shared economic reality of poverty and a vexed relationship to the state on which most communities were also dependent. Marcantonio was a natural outgrowth of that East Harlem. A 1939 speech in Congress in response to a housing bill reflected how he saw his roots. Quote, "Mr. Speaker, as one who was born in the slums, who was raised in the slums, and who still lives in the slums, I take this opportunity to voice the gratitude of the slum dwellers. Go into my district on a hot summer night and see American babies sleeping on the fire escapes, gasping for air." End quote. Marcantonio's rhetoric of class was tied to subjectivity. It was articulated to be where he was from. Leftist politics were all over East Harlem at the time. There were traditions of Italian-American radicalism that Marcantonio was shaped by and plugged into. In the 1920s, as a young protege of Fiorello LaGuardia's, he had organized tenant strikes and worked for greater social services for East Harlem residents. And there was, too, a receptive audience among Puerto Rican residents for Marcantonio's frank socialism. As head of the American Labor Party, Marcantonio argued for workers' rights and poverty relief. These issues, whomever they were associated with, resonated for East Harlem residents. These were politics not only of class, but also of ethnicity. The people Marcantonio worked with and for were immigrants, whose membership in America was still up in the air. Inasmuch as poverty and ethnicity were linked in the experience of living in Harlem, they were also part of how the place appeared in the popular imagination. The image of American babies sleeping on the fire escapes may have been utilized by Marcantonio to garner sympathy from his congressional colleagues, But it also seized upon stereotypes of Italian Harlem as a different kind of place. Whereas those stereotypes, racism really, produced a sense of these immigrants as far removed from the possibilities of American prosperity, Marcantonio insisted upon their Americanness, if not only to lay claim to the net of social services that he struggled to expand. If Italian Harlem was a ghetto for many, Marcantonio then responded to and sought to rework some of that. In this sense, a politics of race and class was also a politics of space. Here we see how the place was constructed by power and discourse. Its boundaries and limits were prescribed by an idea about who could and should occupy the symbolic center of New York, and by extension of the United States itself. But Marcantonio's political spatial sensibility of Harlem broke that enclosure open. By physically crossing ethnic communities and traversing ideas of community itself, Marcantonio could create a new kind of place. And it bears a reminder that all places really are imagined and constructed. Issues of immigration captured Marcantonio's entire constituency, and he spoke to specific ethnics, but in a collective formation. So in 1940, when he argued in a public radio address against the proposed registration of foreign-born, he remarked, "The non-citizen resident is an integral part of America. When the Founding Fathers said in that everlasting document, the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, they did not say that all men are created equal except Italians. They did not say that all men are created equal except Jews. They did not say that all men are created equal except Negroes, nor did they say that all men are created equal except non-citizens. They said that all men are created equal. By this, they meant no discrimination, no segregation, and no persecution of the foreign-born." And what's striking here in this kind of speech that he utilized all the time was the equivalencies between these different groups and these different kinds of racial ethnic issues. Okay. So this is a woodcut by Abner Diamond, who worked with Marcantonio, and I think it says here that he canvassed door to door for his campaign. And the reason I brought it up, obviously it's a very different kind of image from the previous ones, but it also reflects different artistic traditions. The kind of Mexican woodcut is a kind of an aesthetic that's brought into, transposed onto this kind of image of a U.S. politician. So the crossing is in a different realm. Marcantonio's crossings find partial explanation in leftist ideology. He critiqued vast divisions of wealth, especially in New York City, but more generally too. He articulated an internationalism that was conscious of the unequal relationships between first and third world nations, and he was deeply anti-racist. Socialism has often been a cross-cultural language, and for Marcantonio too, this kind of politics allowed him to see the possibilities of crossing over because in fact he already had. Marcantonio had his own and colorful translation of leftist politics into political rhetoric, and those kind of unapologetic flourishes on the floor of the House were part of what made him a hero among people in the American left at the time. In 1946, he bristled at a congressman from Virginia, alas, a congressman from Virginia, speaking of labor as a commodity in response to a proposal that General Motors should pay certain wages. This Congressman Smith had said, "I guess I'm a little bit old-fashioned, but I was raised up in this country, and my ancestors were, and we always went out and we bargained for what we wanted to purchase. If the price suited us, we dealt. If not, we did not." Marcantonio railed. How revealing of utter contempt and disdain for the men and women who toil. It just so happens that the days have gone far past in the United States when labor was considered a commodity. Workers are human beings. They have earned the right to organize and to strike to obtain it. They are not mere commodities to be purchased at a sale and at a price that General Motors, United States Steel, or the gentleman from Virginia are willing to pay. For Marcantonio, indeed for many in Harlem, the argument that class trumps race or ethnicity didn't have a great deal of purchase. In his own world of Harlem, Italians, Puerto Ricans, Jews, and African Americans were workers and were discriminated against because of their ethnic and racial differences. The fact that Marcantonio was different from other congressional representatives, working class Italian, of the community, left wing, and assailed for all of this, was not lost on his constituents. The red baiting, intense red baiting that Marcantonio experienced felt, even to people who may not have been politically left, like an assault against them, against Italian Harlem. Harlem, more broadly, was a space made and structured by difference. Thus, the difference of Marcantonio was seen as analogous to the difference of Harlem, and this allowed for various forms of identification. During his time as a politician in the late 1930s and 1940s, Marcantonio certainly was caught in various winds of change. The neighborhood and the world were changing. Though there may have been different visions of what a place could look like, all Italian, more diverse, cooperative, in conflict, the reality was that Marcantonio's district was increasingly heterogeneous. Marcantonio's relationship to civil rights linked up the world of Harlem and national issues facing African Americans with a world larger than the United States. He intoned in 1943, the effects of anti-poll tax legislation extend beyond our own borders. Not only will the abolition of the poll tax lift the morale of the 13 million loyal Negro Americans in this country, and thereby forge that national unity which is so essential to victory, but it will be living evidence and reaffirmation to our United Nations allies and to the colonial peoples in India, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean of our earnest and high resolve to win the battle for a free and democratic world. In addition to repealing the poll tax, he argued for sufficient funding for the Fair Employment Practices Commission, and in 1945 proposed an inquiry into discrimination against African American players in national baseball, which incidentally produced the most vitriolic letters of all the ones that I saw. I mean, people went nuts about this. He worked on many issues with another Harlem congressman, Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., including an effort to desegregate public schools and other public facilities in Washington, D.C. He established forms of deep solidarity and camaraderie with African American intellectuals, particularly those on the left in Harlem and elsewhere. So this is a picture of him at a union demonstration. You see most of the workers are African American. This is a picture of him with Henry Wallace and, of course, Paul Robeson. So there was a lot of back and forth between him and leaders on the left and African Americans in Harlem, African American political leaders especially. Marcantonio's political work at home was distinctive in its anti-racist and cross-racial appeals, emerging from left-wing organizations. He chaired the Harlem Legislative Conference that was founded in 1937. As our mission statement reads, quote, by a group of social-minded citizens representing the entire community of Harlem. And this group worked for progressive causes such as supporting legislation for housing and education, racial equality, and articulated itself as anti-racist and anti-war. In 1947, they organized for a meeting with the city on the cutting of welfare for many African American and Puerto Rican families, and effectively constructing a class interest through a crossing of racial, ethnic, and geographic boundaries at home, where, you know, at that time, African Americans were in West Harlem, Puerto Ricans, East Harlem, and there were a lot of divisions, and this group, among other groups, really kind of was making a kind of class interest out of the different communities. This movement between territories of different registers, from his place in Harlem, and here he reached out from East Harlem into the broader expanse of Black Harlem, effectively constructing, if not a unity, then certainly a confederation, to a broader national landscape, and then back again, is striking. This is just a picture of him with a very multiracial group of children. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Marcantonio's politics was his wholesale and unremitting support for Puerto Rico. Historian Gerald Meyer has noted that Marcantonio spent more time on Puerto Rican independence than on any other issue, that he was known as a congressman for Puerto Rico. And though this might have been generated from his constituency at home, it had extended further. His work for including Puerto Ricans at home in U.S. Social Security and other federal governmental programs highlighted a kind of civil rights concern. His campaign for the reversal of English as the primary language of instruction in the island, though, is interesting for recognition of cultural preservation and a kind of respect for the cultures of place. His advocacy of independence for Puerto Rico, both introducing a bill in the House of Representatives and supporting organizations in the U.S. that were militating for that goal, was a manifestation of Marcantonio's left internationalism. In a speech in the House in 1939, he said, My interest in Puerto Rico is due not only to the fact that I represent the largest Puerto Rican constituency, of which I am proud, but also to my desire as a progressive to defend the most exploited victims of a most devastating imperialism. I have no personal political axe to grind, nor have I any relatives to protect on the payroll of the government of Puerto Rico. And we see Marc Antonio's commitment to critique economic exploitation too manifested in his concern for the treatment of sugar field and needle workers in Puerto Rico. In terms of this presentation's larger frame of movement and cross-cultures, it's important to highlight in Marc Antonio's words the shifts he makes for a community that he represents, so from that community, and identifies with, that's the community he's proud of, right? Puerto Ricans at home. And this is already a movement out of his kind of Italian-American roots to an advocacy of Puerto Ricans on the island. When Vito Marcantonio left Italian Harlem to travel out of the country for the first and only time in 1936, it was to go to Puerto Rico. And the trip was first cast as a fact-finding venture, but he arrived to find that the National Party of Puerto Rico leader Don Pedro Albizu Campos and 7 of his colleagues were being convicted of conspiracy to overthrow the US government. He actually took on the legal case. Huge groups of people in Puerto Rico greeted him wherever he went, cheering him. And then when he came home, he was met by the largest New York City demonstration to date. Some 10,000 Puerto Ricans were at this demonstration. That's the New York Times count, so could have been even more. The two sides of Puerto Rican diaspora were linked, obviously, in many ways. But Marc Antonio was part of that glue through his political work, mapping a transnational space, and in that way remaking the territories of both El Barrio and Puerto Rico. Not every Puerto Rican in New York City or in Puerto Rico supported Puerto Rican independence. But one could certainly argue, and this is supported in letters and opinion pieces I've read, that the gesture of affiliation with Puerto Rico transcended the variety of positions that people held on actual policies. Marc Antonio's defense of Puerto Rican independence leaders and argument for Spanish and Puerto Rican schools, alongside his sustained arguments for Puerto Ricans as Americans who deserved all the benefits accorded by the US state, create a complex field in which to think about belonging. Who belongs to what and where, in these cases, can be seen to mirror the debates about belonging for Harlem. Who does it belong to? As well as how do its peoples appear within a larger public? Particularly in the ways that all of these cases call up an essential question regarding how it's possible to be different and have that difference respected vis-a-vis authorities, other residents, while also crossing over to something else that is different from you. And here is really kind of the crux of what I call the cross-cultural. We come up against the limits and possibilities of nation too. I want to suggest that life in Harlem allowed people to imagine a different kind of nation, an internation. Here is a place that always had an uneasy relationship to America, even the sense that it was excluded from America. It's not surprising then that a critique of the nation in the form of anti-imperialism or anti-communism or anti-fascism could find fertile ground in that space. To say that Harlem was radical at various points in history has been well documented. But I've wanted here to underscore how this place was remade, reimagined in territorial and social terms by the political and cultural exchanges that were truly radical. And also that the radicalism, say, of a figure like Marc Antonio was made by the place. The confluence of political sympathies to be found in Marc Antonio's work, anti-communism, anti-fascism, anti-imperialism, they all had a particular shape in Harlem. But even as much as there was a critique of nation, there was also an Americanism. Never did Marc Antonio think that America was not important. Nor was America ever not an important frame for Harlem residents, their lives, their imaginations, and their eventual trajectories for him, at least publicly. Left internationalism established a template for multiple nationalist sympathies, being of the nation and critiquing the nation. And here we might see where Marc Antonio's Americanism, his work within a certain model of nation, might be critiqued, even transcended, by non- or anti-national imaginaries that existed in Harlem at the time as well. Everyone in East Harlem, or Harlem as a whole, could not have been sympathetic to Marc Antonio's politics. a critique of income disparities, greater social services for the poor, tenants' rights, equality for African Americans or Puerto Rican independence. That priest, Rafrano's comment certainly suggests opposition, as does the Catholic Church's refusal to give him a Catholic service when he died. And in terms of relations between solidarities among African Americans, Italians, Jews, and Puerto Ricans, certainly there's material to support the classic wisdom of deep antagonisms between these groups. But first, I would look beyond electoral explanations for his political utopian work. So there is an argument that's made that Marcantonio was simply responding to his constituency, right? Arguing for social services, that sort of thing, anti-poverty measures played well in the Italian-American community. Saying he was for Puerto Rican independence, gave him a kind of lock on the Puerto Rican vote. But I also, in the discussion of his ideology, meant to suggest that there's more than that going on. And a contravening example might be seen in the very hard work that Marcantonio did to legislate the right to naturalization for Filipinos residing in the United States. Clearly, this project had little relevance to Marcantonio's constituents. And in fact, when I looked recently at the petitions to push this bill, the original petitions, I noticed that not a single signature was from anyone who lived outside of California. So this was an issue that had a deep kind of relevance for him, but it wasn't, about a kind of political interest group that was going to vote him into office. In terms of that relationship between Marcantonio and his constituents, there is also affect or feeling. This is a hard thing to quantify, and sometimes it seems kind of dumb, right? I like politician X's look, right? But it's more than that. We can't deny that there are powerful connections that draw people in, not only to a politician, but also between and among peoples who might be living in the same space, arguing for similar things, feeling similarly subjectified by the powers that be. We might bring that sensibility about affect into the place of Harlem. Marcantonio was left-wing, and Puerto Ricans in his district were certainly more left-wing than the general population. There can be no doubt that Marcantonio was drawn to them and they were drawn to him. But so were others who could not all share the same politics. Those Italians who might not see eye to eye with him about Puerto Rican causes were moved by his commitment to their everyday issues. In some cases, one sort of attachment, even a sense that he was theirs, of the community, might have allowed people to overlook Marcantonio's politics as a whole, though this need not mean they were unchanged by or pushed by an entirely different set of ideas. These are the necessary and usual divergences of community itself, and in this case should, I hope, help us to rethink boundaries, affiliations, and solidarities. If politics is a complicated endeavor, so are the affects associated with living in a place and interacting with others. I want to suggest that class and racial ethnic difference are not just identities, they are spaces in which to experience crossing. Poverty brought lots of people together. Being different, politically, culturally, racially, as I've noted, is what Harlem was and is all about. Place and difference were twinned in the popular imagination, and that could get turned around. If Marcantonio could stay inside with his own kind, but also move imaginatively across ethnicity to affiliate with those of other races and ethnicities, and take on issues that would seem to belong to others. And if he is in some ways emblematic, I suggest too that this gives a rather different meaning to the place itself. In much of the scholarship, we're often faced with a common story of Italians hating Puerto Ricans and African Americans, that sense that white ethnicity is a racial or racist phenomenon. These ideas converge with some sociological ideas about community shifts. That sense that one group moves in, another moves out, and that there's necessarily a kind of repudiation and a competition. But the reality on the ground is that there's connection and intimacy and lots of different kinds of people learning how to live together. There's also conflict, but being attentive to the exchanges allows us to better understand the moments when differences just can't be negotiated or translated. Those exchanges, maybe they weren't always the coin of the realm, maybe they were flashes at different moments in time, in particular conditions, but they might have had a role in how people thought about race and politics in Harlem. It bears repeating, too, that Marcantonio's politics made for a transnational address. For him, race and ethnicity were global, and allegiances were also global. All this without traveling. He lived and died in East Harlem, was part of that culture and part of that life. The point here is that he didn't have to give that up. It was possible to live deeply in something, in an identity and set of attachments, and also move to something else. He could use an expansive language of place and class, be fluent in Italian, and also speak Spanish and Yiddish. Taken along with other work on racial passing and all sorts of exchanges in Harlem, the figure of Vito Marcantonio presents a different vision of place and different possibilities about how diversity and multiplicity can be navigated. We tend very much in the present to use the frame of multiculturalism, different groups, differences lying side by side, often with very little interaction. Might we develop another model, another language that stresses the exchange, something like cross cultures that has crossing in its very name? In terms of conceptualizing what I've laid out, I would say that there are 4 ways in which to think of Marcantonio's work: class consciousness, anti-racism, cross-cultural affect, and place. And these are kind of autonomous and intertwined. We might see radical politics, too, as inherently cross-cultural. The last image is, this is a painting entitled The Campaign by Ralph Fasanella from 1972. He was a labor activist and a painter who worshipped Marcantonio. And we see here Marcantonio giving a speech at what was called the Lucky Corner, where he gave many speeches. And what's striking about this piece to me is, first, the kind of throngs of people, many different colors, and there's a visual style that echoes Jacob Lawrence, I think, a little bit, and that kind of, the figures and the colors and the angles. But also there's a sense that this corner, this place, is in a larger frame of the city. And by extension, I think the nation and the world. Its energy is in that way directed outward, not inward. Today, Harlem is African American, Puerto Rican, Mexican, Central American, Italian, East Indian, Chinese, West Indian, Senegalese, and more. Not only in terms of actual populations, and in some cases there are scant few of those populations left. There are not many Italians left in East Harlem, and even Puerto Ricans, that population is on the wane. But in terms of historical claims, memories, and ownership over this space, that diversity lives. The clashes of earlier periods are echoed in cultural conflicts spurred by gentrification, all coming to rest on a familiar question: who does this place belong to? Locality, the here and now of place, is global in reach and purview. Boundaries of difference matter to all of us, and so the loftier goal of this work is to reimagine the negotiation of difference, to determine how we might both live in it and develop an ability to cross over. Marcantonio is one kind of guide, deeply of a place, committed and responsible to those interests, but also able to link up rootedness, right, what we think of as the local, with what I would say is a kind of cosmopolitanism. Of course, we're in a different moment. It's really hard to imagine that sort of figure, Marcantonio, in the US Congress today. But this work, I hope, asks us to understand the structure, the contours of such a contribution. Academics love to argue about terminology, and sometimes the debates seem hermetic, but I would say that it does matter which words we use, because they construct and bring to life ideas. We've been exposed to the language of multiculturalism. In many ways, that's the air we breathe. And there's some interest in this concept of the post-racial, which really doesn't do it for me either, because it's suggesting a kind of movement beyond race and its effects. I proposed the term cross-cultural as a way to imagine the style of and the stakes of this project. And for all of that, Vito Marcantonio remains a model and an inspiration. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandhya. And we have 15 minutes for questions. Yes, hang on. So let me bring the mic to you, please, so you'll be recorded.
Thank you. Is that, can you all hear? Okay. Okay, so what a great talk. I love the suggestion that we're all going to become border crossers and to think of ourselves in that way. I'm interested in, you're talking about, I love the way you complicate notions of globality versus locality. But what about the term community, which is one that, is flung about, particularly when you're talking about these multi-ethnic enclaves where there are so many different types of quote-unquote communities existing side by side. How do you conceive of that in your work?
I think that it's not unlike other kinds of racial or ethnic or political solidarities, that there are moments in which certain kinds of affiliation and connections are important, and they're not always or necessarily related to the same thing all the time, right? So community can be performed, right? It can different kinds of communities can be important at different times. So I mean, that's what I was really trying to evoke with Marcantonio. I mean, at times he was really about Italian Harlem. I mean, he was really about those interests, and he spoke in that language, and not just literally in Italian, but also in a way that would be legible, particularly legible to those Italian Americans in that neighborhood. And at that time, that was the most important community to him, right? But at other times, he really understood community in another way, right? A community of migrants. Italians and Puerto Ricans together, right? He made a lot of that. Look, I come from East Harlem. We're all immigrants. We're all have a very problematic relationship to the state, and we all need the state. We all need the assistance. So I think what's interesting about Marcantonio is that he was able to operate in and for a number of different communities simultaneously, right? Community was not all defining.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandhya. I think about some of the similar issues from a different perspective, so this was very interesting to me. I don't think I have a question. I just kind of want to go back and forth with you. You said that we so much live now with this notion of this country as a multicultural democracy, with a specific understanding of multiculturalism as this a modern version of nation of nations, right? Just sort of separate ethnic enclaves. And the only way, at least in the my academic life, to move away from that model, that's embodied in our census as the racial pentagon, racial ethnic pentagon, was in the late 20th century for a moment this whole push for the idea of multi-racial identities. So people that were not accounted for in the racial pentagon because they were multiracial, which was a way to blur the boundaries between the different enclaves, but in a way that was still very much linked to identity politics. You had to testify to this experience with your multiracial body, right? You seem to be interested in something else, in cross cultures for people that don't have a multiracial body to rely on as an authorizing element. So the other sort of historic way to move away from this idea of ethnic enclaves was to think about class politics. So it's interesting that you have to go back to the 1920s and 30s and 40s when that was the way to do it. So my question would be, what would be a contemporary equivalent of Vito Marcantonio in Harlem right now? Would that person have to rely on, on a multiracial body to make claims for crossing cultures? Would that person, he or she, have to rely on class politics to be able to cross? Because it seems that while you didn't invoke multiracial raciality at all, you did invoke class politics, but not as a sort of overarching model here. What I understood is that you were making a claim for space, for place, as creating basis on which this kind of cross-culture, so not a body, not a particular politics, but a place constituted demographically, geographically, culturally in a specific way that authorizes, allows for, or makes this sort of cross-cultural movements and connections authentic, legitimate, viable. So maybe the question in all this is, what would a contemporary Vito Marcantonio look like and work like, and what kind of claims would he make to the public, to his constituents? Do we have to go all the way back to the early 20th century to have a figure like that?
Yeah. No, I mean, all of these points are really interesting. I think that the concept of the multiracial wouldn't be relevant, wouldn't have the same purchase for that period, for that time. Yeah, but I do see the kind of multiracial as giving us some kind of root, outside of the impasse that identity politics gives us, certainly, even though it can end up getting caught in that same morass, right? But I think that one way to think about it for a contemporary moment that maybe wouldn't use multiracial as its moniker would be to think just kind of more generically in terms of multiplicity, right? To think about, say, a figure like Charlie Rangel, whose father was Puerto Rican, and which actually was kind of a surprise because his, in his earlier political, I think his father was Puerto Rican, and he kind of had some complicated relationship with him and disavowed him, and that may be the reason that he played that down. But in more recent years, as he had faced increasing difficulty in becoming reelected, he started to call that up again, like, oh, hey, I'm also Puerto Rican, kind of thing, not just black, remember. But it did bring up this kind of interesting debate about where the boundaries of blackness lay, and particularly in the contemporary moment where there's a crisis. Gentrification is producing a crisis where as I said, middle class people are coming in, upper class people are coming in, and really changing the place of Harlem, all of them, East Harlem, West Harlem, Central Harlem. I mean, it's really not looking the same or going to be the same. And so in response to that, there's been, in some quarters, a sense, no, well, this is ours. This is a black place. And you can really, too, understand that as needing some kind of airtime. But it's certainly generated another set of questions. Well, what does that mean? What does that blackness mean? And the Rangel story, and there's so many really, but the Rangel story brought some of that to light. Well, then what is the relationship between African Americans and Puerto Ricans, and how has that been negotiated historically? So I think that. And then, I said something about how blackness has always been heterogeneously constituted in Harlem, and there's always been a kind of complicated internal debate about what it's meant. Schomburg was from Puerto Rico too, right? So there is that sense. Well, yes, but he ended up, affiliating and identifying with African American culture in New York. But there's also recent work that shows, he was also working with kind of Cubans in Harlem and other black immigrants from the Caribbean who thought of themselves as black, but were putting forth a different notion of blackness.
What was helpful to your formulation that you sort of dwell in one particular identity or one particular kind of difference. You didn't use identity that much, but then could look outward. With the multi-racial movement, it was all about surpassing, right? Not belonging, neither this nor that, and creating sort of a new category. Eventually, the census was a compromise with that. That new category was not created. You could just choose multiple. So I think that's something interesting in it, that the cross-cultural or multiracial or any other kind of pan movements don't have to require an abandonment of your particular location.
Yeah, and then just quickly, the last thing I would say is that, I don't mean to suggest that class consciousness is the only site of cross-culturality. I mean, really, that there can be many different sites of that. Susan?
Just to maybe follow up on that a little bit, I was struck after you were focusing on place and space, and then at the very end you came to affect. And that seemed striking to me. And I wonder if you can open that up a little bit, because it seems to me maybe a little bit more specificity about what affect is and how it plays a role in this. It seems to me that maybe something more like empathy, or I'm not sure what the right word is, but something that allows you to put yourself in the place of somebody else who is actually different, but to be able to put yourself in that other place and I don't know if I don't want to use identification, but empathize with another person and have a kind of ethos of caring and mutual support or whatever it is. So I wonder if there's a way to sort of really think about particular kinds of affect and the way it allows particular kinds of crossings to happen, and to follow along an ideology of class or racial equality or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a problem with the notion of identification.
Yeah.
I think...
but it's something where you're actually being able to put yourself in the place of others and...
but see, well, it doesn't have to be identification, but I do think that, at least for the case of Mark Antonio, the forms of identification that he engaged in as much as, some of them certainly took shape through a kind of class consciousness, were very much about being able to put himself, right, and his people in the place of others, right? And I think it's really striking that it wasn't, oh, we're all the same. It was more like, we're who we are, and you're who you are, but we have this kind of space for sharing and exchange, right? So, and I guess, in terms of, there's a longer discussion to be had about affect, certainly, but really I was thinking about it too in terms of what happens as well when you cross over, right? It's not necessarily that needing to be in the other groups or the other person's shoes is the motivation always. It's that something's happening through whatever activity or whatever kind of process or practice that then allows you to, whatever, empathize, sympathize, take something on as your own, right?
I have just a question. Who ran for office before him and after him, and was he challenged, and did they come close? What was the politics surrounding him?
So he, LaGuardia, Fiorello LaGuardia, lost this seat, and I can't remember exactly who he lost it to. So Mark Antonio became a protege of LaGuardia's, and LaGuardia tapped him to run for this seat. And he initially ran on the Republican ticket, which was because at that time, to be a Democrat was to be associated with Tammany Hall. So LaGuardia had run on LaGuardia had run on the Republican ticket, and so then Mark Antonio ran on the Republican ticket. And lots and lots of support, you know, whatever, consensus, et cetera. And then he got, I think the next election, he got both the Democratic and the Republican nominations. And then,
Makes it pretty easy.
yeah. so
That's
he was-
cross-cultural.
Right. He was really crossing there, yeah. So he was a shoo-in. And I may get the chronology slightly off, but then a law was passed specifically to deny him his seat, that you couldn't actually run in the primary on both sides. Yeah, there's some particular legality there. And he lost one election in between. And then he, you know, this was also the American Labor Party was very active at this time. So he was the head of the American Labor Party. And he, so one election it was all three, Republican, Democrat, American Labor Party. Then it was Democratic Party and American Labor Party. And then, you know, there's a lot of red baiting. And so, you know, even and maybe particularly among Democrats. So his last election he won as American Labor Party candidate.
Thank you so much, Sonia.